Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It was only 2.5 years ago, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made an explosive claim in the House of Commons.
Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen.
But as Prime Minister Mark Carney met with his Indian counterpart in New Delhi last week, there was no mention of the killing, the diplomatic rift that followed, nor of India's alleged role in the violence campaigns targeting Sikh Canadians.
This is not merely the renewal of a relationship. It is the expansion of a valued partnership with new ambition, focus, and foresight.
Canada and India are actively resetting their relationship, and a lack of answers about the possible national security threat posed by New Delhi did not stop Prime Minister Carney from signing billions in trade with India. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Amarnath Amarasingam, Associate Professor at Queen's University, to try to make sense of the government's position. Amar, thanks so much for making the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I'm hoping before we get into the details of what unfolded last week, if you could just help paint a picture for us, because the role of politicians is very different than that of national security and law enforcement officials. I guess just first and foremost, what is the role of agencies like CSIS and the RCMP and the NSIA when it comes to making sure that policymakers understand the risks they're taking in the decisions that they ultimately take?
Yeah, I mean, these agencies are basically tasked with keeping Canadians safe, and that means monitoring overseas conversations, signals intelligence, open source information, talking to community members, different diaspora groups in Canada to make to see what to think about what they're experiencing and what's going on in these communities, and so they basically collate all of these different pieces of information that's coming in, and provide the government, politicians, with a kind of snapshot of what the landscape, what the threat landscape looks like from whatever country you're talking about, whether it's India, China, or Russia. So they don't necessarily make decisions for the policymakers or the politicians, but they try to advise the best course of action for what the threat landscape looks like and how it's impacting Canadians, and with the assumption or with the hope that the politicians will take that into consideration when making political decisions.
So to recap on what unfolded here in the specific incident that we're speaking about, on the eve of Mark Carney's first trip to India as Prime Minister, a senior government official tells reporters in a background briefing that foreign interference and transnational repression by India has essentially ceased. And I'm paraphrasing here, but this official says that if this was still a concern, the government wouldn't be taking this trip in the first place. Then during that visit to India, there is no clarity on Canada's position from the Prime Minister. But when Mark Carney is in Australia, which is stop 2 of this 3-legged tour through the Indo-Pacific, he then tells reporters that those are not the words that he would use. But Canadians, I think in my assessment, still don't get a straight answer from the Prime Minister as to whether or not India still possesses a national security threat. I suppose, what's your assessment of what we've heard from the Prime Minister?
I mean, it makes sense that he would speak in that language, because on the one hand, just the day before that news article came out, there was more news articles talking about how certain Sikh activists in Canada had been approached by CSIS with a kind of what we call a duty to warn, right? Which is that there is a kind of active threat against your family, yourself or your family, and we are letting you know that threat exists, and kind of advising you to take proper precautions. And so for that to come out the day before this other article or this other report to say that all threats have stopped was I guess pretty interesting. But for Carney or for the Prime Minister, I think it is he is very careful about how he speaks to the public, and I think it's not surprising that he would have been careful with his choice of words. Especially when you're trying to rebuild trade relationships and things like that with the Indian government. From our own research, I'm currently involved in a transnational repression project where we're talking to diaspora groups from India, China, and Iran, and it's absolutely clear that India still poses a kind of ongoing threat to diaspora communities here. There's been reports of surveillance, threatening phone calls, people being followed, and ongoing threats. And so I think that's still very much a concern for members of the Sikh diaspora here, regardless of what's being said politically.
And I do have questions about that duty to warn, but just based off what you said, would you know if Canada's position would have been informed by that kind of evidence, by the intelligence, or if the message from the government, contradicts what Canadian intelligence may have found?
Yeah, I think from a political standpoint, they're trying to have it both ways. So Carney has used words like values-based realism, and others have called it a principled pragmatism, and so on. And so I think there's a very concerted effort to balance, human rights with what's actually happening south of the border, and to try to kind of offset some of the the protectionism that we're seeing in the United States to expand our trading partners, and so that's a very kind of difficult line that Carney is trying to walk, because on the one hand you do have not only from India but from China as well constant interference and constant harassment of diaspora communities here who are Canadians and who deserve protection from our government, and at the same time he does want to have a kind of broader economic conversation about, with what's happening in the U.S., where else can we go and to get to make sure our economy is protected from some of the trends that we're seeing down south. And India, is the world's fourth or fifth largest economy. It in itself is a competition with its neighbor China, and is trying to open its markets up more and more. And so at the same time that America is becoming increasingly protectionist, Canada is going to need these markets. And at current, it's not a huge export market for us. I think it's around 1 or 2%, and so there is kind of room for growth there. So it is a difficult line to kind of speak from both sides of your mouth, I guess, on recognizing that these governments are a threat to our communities here and an ongoing threat to our communities here, but at the same time keeping that broader financial or economic trade conversation going as well. So what he says publicly on these will be tempered by what one hopes, I guess, is being talked about privately with these governments, and about what they're doing in our countries and what they're doing to our citizens here.
And I certainly wouldn't want to take away from the impetus of why he went on this trip and the need to diversify our trade beyond the very unpredictable United States. But this is a pretty drastic change in messaging from the Liberal government just 2.5 years ago, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the time publicly accused agents of the Modi government of being involved in the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Then the RCMP claims it has evidence of the Indian government engaging in a campaign of violence, extortion, intimidation against the Sikh community. I just wonder, how do we as Canadians make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough one, and I think a lot of my friends in the Sikh community are quite upset. A lot of my friends in the Tibetan and Uyghur communities, and Hong Kong activists are all equally upset for some very similar reasons, which is that on the one hand, the Canadian government is speaking very openly about protecting its diaspora communities and shoring up support for our communities. It's having a foreign interference commission. It's talking about transnational repression, and it's putting kind of research money and programming money towards some of those projects. But at the same time, is sitting across the table with the Indian government and the Chinese government and working on trade deals, right? And so I think part of that is potentially a communications issue. The Canadian government needs to kind of communicate with its own citizens, particularly its diaspora communities that are in the crosshairs of these countries, and that usually means activist communities. to tell them what they're up to and the kind of protections that are available to them and the kind of conversations that they're having behind closed doors with the leaders of India and China and other countries. Because at the moment, it seems like what these communities feel or how these communities feel is that the government isn't really being honest with them or is willing to betray them for the sake of trade deals and financial decisions, which may or may not be the case, but that communication needs to be a bit more forthright, I think.
Based on, the research you've done, as you've just told us, or as you told us earlier, I should say, the national security threat has not ceased. But is there a world in which, or has your research suggested in any way that the behavior from India has changed at all?
Not really. I think with India in particular, it has been blaming what it sees as Canada's kind of soft hand towards Khalistani or kind of the Sikh separate states, Khalistani activism in Canada since the 1980s, right? And so there are articles. A Sikh activist friend of mine just sent me an article from the Toronto Star dated 1984 that says something like, CSIS warns that Indian agents are active in Canada, right? So that's how far back this conversation goes, and from the Indian government's perspective, the Canadian government has always been what they call soft on terrorism and soft on Khalistani activism, and they've kind of, that's been their tone and for a very long time. We have to remember, like, this is the context of the Air India bombing, which killed 329 people, still the most deadliest terrorist attack in Canadian history. You have the kind of the famous incident of Jaspal Atwal, who showed up in a photo with Justin Trudeau's wife and invited to a Canadian High Commission event in India, which the Indian government was quite upset about because he was convicted of attempting to kill several individuals in Canada, including being behind the 1985 attack on Ujjal Dosanjh, who was at the time just starting out in politics. And so from the Indian government's perspective, they have been telling the Canadian government for decades about the Khalistani threat, and Canada hasn't done anything about it. And so and that escalated to the Nijar killing, right? And so I think for them, Canada's not going to do something about it, and therefore we're going to have to send our agents and send our people to take care of what we think is a national security threat. And so that has been a very long running argument by the Indian government, which is and it's been across different governments and different prime ministers. And so I think that anxiety and that insecurity is always going to be there, regardless of what trade conversations are being had at the same time. And so that creates a problem for Canadians, because for us, activism is democratically protected, right? And so it doesn't matter that you want a separate state in India, that's still protected speech in Canada. But from an Indian government's perspective, we are supporting terrorism, and Canadian government is, allowing terrorist movements to operate freely. And so it's a fundamental disconnect and disagreement about what the movement or, what the different diaspora causes in Canada mean to these governments, and that's not easily just swept under the rug, I think.
And then I should ask you too then what your research shows about activity by Sikh extremists in Canada, or Khalistani extremists here in Canada. Do you have evidence that it stopped, or that activity is still ongoing?
So the Khalistani movement is still very much active, in the sense of, there's a support for a separate state, or there's a support for some sort of increased rights for the Sikh population in India.
Of course. I guess I mean like violence.
Yeah, the support for violence has largely subsided. I don't see any evidence or even any indication from CSIS or the RCMP that there's still kind of active plots or fundraising for listed terrorist entities or anything like that going on. What I can say from my interviews with activists on the scene, activists in Canada, is that the Nijar killing brought a kind of new generation of Sikhs to the cause, in the sense of they really felt, and a lot of young people have told me this, which is that, if the Indian government's willing to send in a literal hit squad across the ocean to take out one of our leaders, then, we definitely need to be more politically conscious and politically aware and, stand up for our community. And so it's brought a kind of new generation of, I think, activists to this idea that, Sikh identity needs to be protected and fought for. That's largely taking the form of lobbying and, democratically protected activism at the moment. But so we haven't necessarily seen that kind of tip over into violence like a couple decades ago.
When we say India still poses a national security threat, is that always indicative of it being state-sponsored?
I mean, it depends what kind of violence we're talking about, I guess, in India, because or in Canada, because certain kinds of activism, certain kinds of violence when they kind of occur in Canada, could be just generically gang related, for instance, right? But so we have seen indications of that. But what's also true is that the Nijar killing. And we know this from some of the American investigations and American evidence, is that there was a literal kind of Indian government official who initiated the plot. He then directed that plot from India, hired a kind of criminal contact who can arrange a hitman for him. And then this hitman just happened to be an undercover U.S. law enforcement officer who was, offered $100,000 for the murder, and $15,000 was given in advance. So we know a lot of the details about what happened in an American plot based on the American investigation. But in this investigation, Nijar is mentioned, right? And so Nijar is mentioned as being third or fourth on the hit list, and that there are many targets and many targets in Canada as well. And so we know that the plot isn't just, I guess, random gang violence or something like that, that the Americans at least have been able to trace it through wiretaps and photos to all the way back to Indian officials. Of course, the Indian government has said, well, we don't know anything about this official and what he's up to or what, all of his plans. But these kinds of political violence, it does seem to have some direction, I guess, from people in the Indian government. At the same time, they've also hired or been willing to use kind of gangs, well-known gangs in Canada, to carry out some of their plots. And so Canada just recently listed, quite surprisingly, the Lawrence Bishnoi gang, which is a kind of important criminal network operating out of India, and has kind of tentacles, I guess, in parts of Canada as well, to carry out as kind of shooters for hire, right? And so that's also been linked back to different Indian officials as well. So sometimes these attacks seem random and related to things like drugs and turf and things like that, but other times, especially when they have a political flavor to them, you can kind of trace it back to their source.
I want to pick up on that point because, as you mentioned earlier, the head of the Sikh Federation of Canada, as you know, the Prime Minister is trying to manage this kind of muddled messaging around what his senior government official said. The head of the Sikh Federation of Canada said he was informed about threats against him and his family by police in Vancouver. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that RCMP doesn't confirm the origin of the threat in these duties to warn. In your eyes, could it have come from anywhere else other than India?
Not really. I mean, yeah, you're right in the sense of they're not required to say, or they're not allowed to say, I guess, where these threats are coming from. But if you're a Sikh activist in British Columbia or in Ontario or wherever, and you are a very vocal Sikh activist, either pro-Khalistani or at least talking about Sikh rights in India, and you're getting threats, it's almost very likely to be from India. I don't see where else it would be coming from. Plus, I think even though they may not publicly say it, a lot of the people that I've spoken with who have gotten duty to warns do get told by officials like where that threat is coming from. It's just maybe doesn't become public. And I guess related to that, there are a lot of duty to warns that have been going out for Sikh activists, Tibetan activists, Uyghur activists in Canada. A good chunk of them don't make media attention or don't make the news, but CSIS and RCMP have been talking to a lot of activist diaspora members over the years and telling them that threats to their lives exists. Not everyone goes to the media about it, but because sometimes it seems like, there's only one or two that kind of make a splash in the media, but there are dozens of these duty to warns that go out to activists all the time.
I suppose then, how would you advise the federal government about approaching countries like India or China?
I think you need to have a clear conversation about whether you're willing to. I guess we need to have a conversation with ourselves in some ways about what we're willing to tolerate from our trade deals, right? And I think strengthening economic relationships can create jobs and create investment, but are we compromising our kind of stated commitment to human rights? Are we compromising our commitment to the protection of our diaspora communities? I think sometimes these conversations get pushed to the sideline because it almost sounds like internal diaspora politics to kind of mainstream Canadian audiences. They brought this conflict from over there to our country. It's a kind of imported conflict. They have to kind of give up these age-old back home politics when they arrive here, that sort of thing. But I think we need to reframe that conversation to say these are Canadian citizens being threatened by a foreign entity on Canadian soil. It doesn't really matter if the diaspora politics is so specific to that community or part of some globalized conflict that goes back decades. But the baseline is that these are Canadian citizens that are being threatened by foreign actors, and that needs to be reinforced sometimes because. Yeah, I do feel like sometimes the conversation around this issue is like, they brought this conflict from back home and they need to just get over it, right? Whereas I think it's a bit more complicated than that. But from the Canadian government standpoint, I mean, I get why this movement is happening, but I also hope that at least behind closed doors, even if they're not open about it with the rest of Canada, that diaspora concerns are being put front and center in the midst of these trade conversations.
Do you think it really is possible to increase engagement with India and China while also protecting Canadian interests and values?
I mean, I personally find it hard to believe, but I've also never spent any time in government, so I don't know. But I find it very hard to see how this moves forward because the Indian government has always kind of been had this issue of internal enemies front and center, and the same thing is true with China when it comes to the Uyghurs and Tibetans, right? And I think there's a constant sense that for both of these countries, nationalism means territorial unity, the absence of kind of any activist minority identity, the absence of separatism, to be sure, and they're going to do their best to try to stamp all of that out. It just so happens that we have very vibrant diaspora communities from all of these regions in Canada, from the Uyghurs to the Tibetans to Hong Kong to Taiwanese to Sikhs, etc., who are politically active and who do concern themselves with the politics of their home countries and where their families still reside and so on. And we've also seen when these people are active and activist here, they get a knock on their families, get a knock on the door back home. Their visas are put under threat. Sometimes their student visas are threatened to be taken away. And so this is a kind of ongoing presence, I guess, in the lives of a lot of these activists and community members. And so at the same time that that's happening, we're increasing our relationship with them, increasing our trade talks with them. And so I just don't know how you square all of that, right? Because I think sometimes when this splashes into the media, it seems like a one-off thing. It's like, oh, this guy was warned by CSIS that there's a threat against his life, but it's actually just a constant presence in the lives of a lot of diaspora communities. Whether you're talking about Russia, China, India, Iran. There's a constant kind of presence of the long arm of these governments in these communities, and once in a while that may trickle to the media, but other times it's just an everyday thing, which I don't know how you square that with forming relationships with Indian universities and the uranium deals and all of these kinds of things. It just seems like two separate conversations.
Amar, I really appreciate your insight today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Reach us on Instagram at FrequencyPods or on Blue Sky at The Big Story. If you know someone who might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks so much for listening.